On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss U.S.-Saudi relations with the author and activist Medea Benjamin.
The crux of the matter is start a campaign for divesting from the weapons industry, because while we criticize the Saudis, and we should, it really comes back to us. It's our weapons companies that are profiting from this.
On Contact, neoliberalism, patriotism. Truth is not. Socialism, counterweight, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolts unmasked. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Saudi Arabia carried out 158 executions, 63 for nonviolent drug crimes last year, often through public beheadings. Early this year, it executed 47 men for terrorism-related offenses, including the prominent Shia cleric Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. It practices gender apartheid against women who cannot drive, are banned from most jobs, and are controlled by male guardians. It prohibits freedom of expression, including freedom of religion. Homosexuals can be put to death. It has crushed democratic movements in Egypt and Bahrain. It uses banned cluster munitions on civilian targets in Yemen, and it promotes a fundamentalist form of Sunni Islam throughout the Muslim world known as Wahhabism that sanctifies violence against those considered infidels or apostates, including Sufis and Shiites. The autocratic ruling Saudi royal family, whose wealth is estimated at $1.4 trillion, lives lives of unimagined extravagance and often decadence. And yet, Saudi Arabia is considered one of our closest allies in the Middle East. RT correspondent Anya Parampil looks at the long alliance between one of the world's most oppressive regimes and the United States.
When you think of U.S. allies in the Middle East, perhaps you think of Israel or Egypt. And while it's true those countries receive the most military aid from the U.S., a different country is actually responsible for buying the most American weapons in the world. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the U.S. is responsible for 33% of global arms exports. Saudi Arabia absorbs nearly 10% of those weapons, making it the largest purchaser of U.S. weapons in the world. In fact, according to a report by Reuters, the Obama administration has offered Saudi Arabia a record-breaking $115 billion worth of arms in the past 8 years alone. That's more than any other president throughout the U.S.'s 71-year relationship with the Gulf Kingdom. It's a relationship that can be traced back to 1933, when King Ibn al-Saud granted a concession to U.S. energy company Standard Oil of California, leading to the creation of Aramco, or the Arabian American Oil Company. From that point on, Saudi Arabia and the U.S. remained close, with President Franklin D. Roosevelt declaring in 1943, "The defense of Saudi Arabia is vital to the defense of the United States." After World War II, Saudi Arabia became a vital partner in countering Soviet interests in the region, and thus a dispensable ally in the Cold War. Since the fall of the Shah in Iran in 1979, Saudi Arabia has also balanced growing Iranian or other anti-Western influence in the Middle East, often through funding Sunni extremist groups. They're the same extremist groups the United States often finds itself battling in the so-called war on terror. But that reality hasn't prevented our government from continuing to ship weapons to the country at record rates.
Thank you, Anya. Medea Benjamin is a tireless campaigner for human rights. She was one of the founders of Code Pink and the fair trade advocacy group Global Exchange. She has organized many protests against the U.S. interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria, and been arrested for her activism innumerable times. Medea is the author of Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, and her latest book is Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. So let's talk about this special relationship with Saudi Arabia, especially in light of the fact that, as you point out in the book, we only now take 13% of Saudi oil.
Yes, certainly the relationship was started out on the basis of oil when the Saudi kingdom was first established in 1932, then oil discovered in the 30s, and then for 12 different administrations, Republican and Democrat, a close relationship with the Saudis based on oil. But as the years went by, the U.S. produced more of its own oil, imported more from Canada, And so oil is not as important as it was. The U.S. wants to be able to control where that oil goes to other countries, but the relationship has really started to shift in terms of what is the big focus. And as I say in the book, I think the big focus is now that they've become the #1 purchaser of U.S. weapons by far.
$100 billion over the last 10 years?
115 billion over the last 8 years.
Oh,
That's
okay.
just under the Obama administration alone.
Wow.
It's a staggering sum, and it's amazing that it's been 43 different deals just under the Obama administration, and Congress has just rubber stamped, rubber stamped, rubber stamped every single one.
Let's talk about Saudi society, which you spend quite a bit of time in the book speaking about. Give us a profile of what Saudi Arabia is like.
One of the most repressive countries in the world, where there is no freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, no political parties, no unions allowed, where dissent is treated as treason. You can be beheaded for insulting Islam, for insulting the king, for spreading atheism, for being convicted of being a homosexual, for sorcery.
Right.
There is discrimination against entire groups of people, like women, who are not only forced to fully cover in public, and the only country where women aren't allowed to drive, but a guardianship system where women have to have a male legal guardian from the day they're born to the day they die.
You call it gender apartheid.
Gender apartheid. It's the most sex-segregated society in the world. Immigrant population,
Which we should be clear is huge.
Huge. Of a 30 million population, 10 million are migrant workers, many of whom are coming from some of the poorest countries in the world and are treated like indentured servants.
Talk about how they're treated, which you do speak about in detail in the book.
Well, first let's say slavery was only eliminated in 1962 in Saudi Arabia, and with this huge oil money that has flooded the country, many people, including middle-class Saudis, have used the money to bring in foreign workers, and it's a sponsorship program. You can't just say, oh, I'm from a poor country in Bangladesh, I'm going to go try my luck in Saudi Arabia. You have to have a sponsor, and the sponsor then becomes like your owner. You couldn't even leave the country if you don't get permission from your employer, and you're treated like an indentured servant.
And you have no redress if you're abused.
You have no redress, you have no ability to fight back, you have, the only thing you can do is try to contact your embassy, and good luck if they're going to come to your help. And even though it's become illegal, Saudi employers still take passports.
And they're worked 15 hours a day, wage theft, sexual abuse of women is very common.
I mean, since there are no ways to monitor how you're treated in somebody's home, all kinds of abuses, and I tell some of the horrific examples in the book, but there's also the people working in the 110-degree heat doing the construction work, and I would say that when you have 10 million out of a 30 million population who are doing the hard physical labor as well as the domestic labor, there is just so much room for abuse.
And the religious police.
And the religious police. You know, I was naive to think that Saudi Arabia as a theocracy would have respect for people's religion. Well, the religious police impose religion on the Saudi people, but for anybody who is not a Muslim, and of these millions of workers, 2 million of them are Christian, it is illegal to build a church or any non-Muslim place of worship. And it's illegal it was illegal until 2004 to even come in the country if you were Jewish.
Well, they persecute plenty of Muslims, Shiites,
Sufis, that's right. It has to be the Wahhabi version of the Sunni religion that is the state-sponsored version, and any one who deviates from that is discriminated against.
The oil is in the eastern, most of it, in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, which is a Shiite area, and yet the Shiites are the poorest, most repressed group within Saudi Arabia. Earlier this year, of course, they executed the Shiite cleric, Sheikh al-Nimr.
That's right, and you would think that because it's under their ground that you have the vast oil wealth, that this would be the wealthiest part of the country. But no, and I think the Saudi rulers have always been terrified that the Shia will rise up and take their oil with them. And of course, they have always been terrified of the relationship with Iran and the
which is Shia.
Which is Shia. So discrimination, yes, against the entire Shia population.
Which looks like what?
Well, it means that in the public schools you are taught the Sunni version. It means
it's not Sunni, Wahhabi.
The Wahhabi Sunni version. That's right. Thank you for the correction on that. It means that you don't see many Shia in high levels of government or in the security forces or in the military. It means that in employment you can only go so far. And the Shia tend to have the poorer paid jobs in the oil sector, and when they have risen up, even for issues like labor rights, they have been crushed by the Saudi government.
Very brutally. The royal family, what was it, $1.7 trillion they're worth? Talk about a little bit, not only in terms of their absolute autocratic power, but their lifestyle.
Well, herein comes the incredible hypocrisy of the Saudi ruling family, which is quite large. You have about 200 princes, but then you have thousands who are in the outer circle of the princes, and they all are heavily subsidized by the Saudi government. They don't have to work, and their lifestyles are the lifestyles of the rich and famous, and not the religious.
Of the global elite. And
so, yes.
Some of the wealth, as you document in the book, is quite staggering in terms of personal wealth.
Right, and the way they throw that wealth around. It can be in the casinos in the most luxurious parts of the world. They have been caught with prostitutes.
I was in a hotel in Beirut, and I was with a high-ranking Saudi prince, and the hotel was flooded with prostitutes. He had the top floors that were up there, paid $1,500 a night to go up. Yeah. The lifestyle is despite the Wahhabism, the lifestyle is exceedingly decadent.
Well, that's right. And even inside Saudi Arabia, they don't get visited by the religious police. So if you go into Saudi wealthy elite of the ruling kingdom homes, you will find the liquor, you will find music, of course, you will find all of the Western vices.
And these people are flying 747s as personal jets.
And they have their yachts that they bought off the hands of Trump, right? Bailing out Trump by buying his yachts and his hotels.
We'll return with the activist and author, Medea Benjamin, after this break.
A vote for Kennedy would avoid nuclear crisis.
A vote for LBJ was a vote for the Vietnam War.
A vote for Reagan sent the Berlin Wall crashing down.
A vote for Bush was a vote to invade Iraq.
Not once, but twice. Your vote for President of the United States
will echo worldwide.
On Election Day, we go worldwide.
Worldwide.
Only on RT.
For decades, the American middle class has been railroaded by Washington politics. Big money corporate interest has drowned out a lot of voices. That's how it is in the news culture in this country now. That's where I come in. I'm Ed Schultz. I do the news on RT America. I'll make sure you don't get railroaded, and you'll get the straight talk and the straight news. Question more.
I'm Tom Harpin, and I'll give you what the mainstream media can't, the big picture.
There's been no charges filed in
And when you question more, you find what you're looking for.
This is the legislative branch of the parliament.
We'll go deeper, investigate, and debate, all so you can get the big picture.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent countless hours poring through documents that tell the story about the ugliest side of corporate America. Corporate media refuses to talk about these issues.
The conduct by this company was deplorable.
I'm going to paint a clear picture about how disturbing, how corrupt corporate conduct has become in modern America. These are stories that no one else can tell. I'm Mike Papantonio, host of America's Lawyer. Question more.
What'd you have for breakfast yesterday? Why would you pick those shoes? How fast is your Wi-Fi? What's your dog's name? Why'd you name him that? What's your biggest fear in life? Ever been on a hayride? When's the last time you read a book? What would you say if you ever met the Pope? Who's the best quarterback of all time? What's one topping that doesn't belong on a pizza? Now, I've interviewed you too. Question more.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to On Contact. We'll continue our conversation with Medea Benjamin, author of Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. One of the things that I think that's not widely recognized, which you point out in your book, is the rate of poverty, which is quite high, the growing unemployment within Saudi Arabia itself.
Well, this is something the Saudis try to hide. You know, they don't want anybody to know there's poverty. And now we're talking not just among the migrant population, among the Saudis themselves. In fact, I document in the book how there was two young men who did a video about the underside of Saudi society, and they ended up in jail for it. So, yes, there is poverty.
We're talking about slums, roach-infested slums.
That's right, and especially now more so with the cuts in these subsidies and the rising unemployment rate. And it's a very young population, and the young males are having a hard time finding employment. Educated women are having a hard time finding an employment. And the government, what they're trying to do is force the private employers to hire Saudis instead of foreigners.
Right.
But the Saudis don't want to work like the foreigners do. And
one of the things that you point out in the book is that Saudi Arabia is barreling towards financial crisis. Was it the IMF report that unless there are major changes, the kingdom will be bankrupt by, I think, 2030?
Well, the kingdom is trying to suck every last drop of oil out and trying to manipulate the prices now to keep their market share and then drive the prices up. But, you know, let's face it, oil is a commodity that's not going to be around forever. And although they're talking about diversifying, they've been talking about diversifying for a long time, and still 80% of their revenue comes from oil.
They were very active, the Saudi regime, in crushing the democratic movements, Bahrain, Egypt, because, of course, being an autocratic state, they do not want to see, as we saw with the Arab Spring, the rise of these popular movements. So they played a very dark role throughout the region, especially since the Arab Spring.
Well, I would say since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when they were terrified of Iran's influence and they started spreading theirs by opening up these mosques and madrasas, schools all over the place.
That disseminated Wahhabi ideology.
Yes. And this is where the basis of these groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS came from. But you look more recently, and yes, terrified at the Arab Spring, and crushed the uprising in Bahrain using U.S. tanks.
Well, and they sent their own security forces into Bahrain to do it.
That's right.
Or they were invited in, but
by the autocratic government.
Right.
Yes, and in Egypt they continue to be the #1 financier of this coup government that came to power, killing thousands.
To the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars.
No, to the tune of $5 billion.
Is it $5 billion?
Yeah.
And let's talk about Yemen.
It started in March of last year.
So they've sealed off the country. They're using cluster bombs. They are attacking power plants, water purification plants, schools, factories that make potato chips, health clinics. They just bombed a mourning hall. What are they doing there?
They took the country that was already one of the poorest in the Arab world, and they've turned it into a catastrophic situation. We count the 10,000 plus people who have died, but it's way more than that, Chris, if you look at people who have died because they can't get food and they can't get medicine. And 80% of the population now is depending on humanitarian aid. They import most of their food, and they can't get it in. There's a blockade that the Saudis are imposing. So this is just a catastrophic situation that the United States has facilitated.
And we'll talk about that, but why? Why are they, what is this relentless bombing campaign of Yemen about?
It's all about their nemesis with the Iranians and their fear that the tribal group Houthi that is closer to the Shia, their fear that this will give the Iranians an inroad on their border, and this is all about fighting Iran through a proxy war.
With U.S. weapons.
With U.S. weapons, with U.S. logistical support, with U.S. refueling their planes in the air, with the U.S. intelligence, and with U.S. diplomatic cover.
And we spoke about the king's younger son, who is kind of tied his fortunes to this campaign.
Well, yes, which is one of the reasons they don't know how to get out of it now, because this was his idea. I think he's a brash young man, a la George Bush, who said, let's go in and get Saddam Hussein out, and it'll take us a couple of weeks and we'll be done. And here they are 19 months later, and the U.S. finally saying, look, this is looking bad. This is making us look bad and hypocritical that we are supporting you while we are trashing the Russians for what they're doing. And the U.S. Trying to push for a ceasefire, for peace talks, which has broke down. And it's just a nasty situation. And as Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut said, the Yemeni people are seeing this as a U.S. war and seeing that we have blood on our hands. It's terrible for the Yemeni people, and it's terrible for us.
Let's talk about the Saudi influence in Washington. And it does have an outsized influence because it's ranked by human rights groups right up there with North Korea. Even the U.S. government has to sign, or presidents have to sign exemptions in order for us to do business with Saudi Arabia.
And we've been signing those exemptions constantly. The Saudis have been very clever. Not only do we buy their oil and they buy our weapons, but they've invested a lot of their money in the U.S. economy. You look around New York City, Uber, $3.5 billion, gets them a seat on the board, investing in New York real estate, investing in U.S. companies, investing in the largest oil refineries in Texas, and then using checkbook diplomacy. So they are giving money out to Ivy League schools. They're giving Harvard, Yale. Yes, giving money to U.S. think tanks, including the liberal think tanks like the Brookings Institute or Atlantic Council. And then, of course, there are the foundations like the Clinton Foundation, the Carter Foundation.
How much to?
Between $10 and $25 million. They won't tell us. The Carter Foundation, the John McCain Foundation, and they then hire lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to put this very smiley face on this.
And they've been quite effective.
They have been very effective when you see how little of an uprising there is among the American people to say, here we've spent over $5 trillion on this war on terror, and yet we are arming the country that is most responsible for spreading terrorism.
And let's go into that, because 11 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia.
15 of the 19 hijackers.
Sorry. And that 28 or 29 page section of the report that was released made it clear that the Saudis financially were supporting some of the hijackers, and they have given tremendous sums of money and weapons to Al-Qaeda-linked or ISIS-linked groups in Syria.
Well, that's right, and we see through the WikiLeaks cables, the time Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State pulling her hair out. What are we going to do about these Saudis? And what does she do? She authorizes more weapons sales. Right. But yes, and one of the positive things that has happened is Congress passing a law allowing 9/11 families to sue Saudi Arabia in U.S. courts, despite the veto of the Obama administration. And many of these 9/11 families for 15 years have been saying, we just want information. Just give us all the information that you know. And now the only way they think they can get that is through the courts. And let's see how that works.
And what do we do? What should be our response?
Well, our response should be, number one, stop weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. We had one small victory, which is stopping the cluster bomb sales, and the company making the cluster bombs saying they wouldn't make them anymore. But we have to look at the whole array of weapons that we sell to Saudi Arabia and say no to selling those weapons. We have to do more to support the nonviolent dissidents who are being given large jail sentences or even on death row. And, bloggers, human rights activists, lawyers. We need to sanction Saudi Arabia according to our laws for the lack of tolerance for religious freedom. We have to, I think, the crux of the matter is start a campaign for divesting from the weapons industry, because while we criticize the Saudis, and we should, it really comes back to us. It's our weapons companies that are profiting from this. They are the ones that we have to focus on, and just like the environmentalists have focused on a campaign to divest from the fossil fuel industry, we have to do a campaign to divest from the weapons industry.
And we should be clear that when it comes to the defense of Saudi Arabia, it is always, I was in the first Gulf War, been American troops. I was in the town of Hafji when the Iraqis attacked, and the Saudi army leapt on every vehicle they could get their hands on, including fire trucks, and fled, and the U.S. Marine Corps alone went in, although Schwarzkopf and everyone lied about it, until we who were there exposed it.
Well, and this is what Osama bin Laden said was the turning point in his life, is seeing 500,000 U.S. troops going into the Saudi Holy Lands. So we should pull out all U.S. troops from the area. We should close the base that we have there. We should really be reevaluating our relationship with the Saudis, which would allow us to have a more even-handed relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And just like we look for solutions in Syria, it has to be that all of these foreign powers, we have to stop arming the Saudis, because the Saudis are arming all these other groups in the region.
Including groups that see as their goal the attack of Americans.
That's right. And I think to wake up to the fact that it makes absolutely no sense to be arming the people who are forming not only the ideological basis, but providing the weapons and the physical support to these terrorist groups.
Great. Thank you, Medea. That was Medea Benjamin, author of Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. The alliance between the corrupt and tyrannical House of Saud and the United States is based on oil. But as oil prices drop and our dependence on Saudi oil diminishes, it is essential that we re-examine our relationship. If an arms embargo is justified against Israel, as I believe it is certainly justified against Saudi Arabia. We need to support the democratic aspirations of its people, many living under terrible oppression. We need to recognize that our real allies in Saudi Arabia are not the decadent ruling elites. They are women, imprisoned journalists and human rights campaigners, pro-democracy advocates, migrant workers who are often treated little better than slaves, and religious minorities. With our support, they can build a modern, open society. Without it, they are condemned to medieval barbarity. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.